Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Dr. Norman Myers. Norman Myers is an environmental scientist who has been called the Paul Revere of the environmental movement. He is a fellow at Green College, Oxford University, the Andrew D. White Professor at Large at Cornell University, and an advisor at the World Bank's Global Environment Facility. He is at Berkeley as the Charles M. and Martha Hitchcock Professor. Professor Myers has won many awards, including the Volvo Environment Prize and the United Nations Sasakawa Prize. He has published more than 250 papers in professional journals, 300 popular articles in newspapers and magazines, and 15 books with sales of 1 million copies in 11 languages. He is the originator of the biodiversity hotspot strategy that has generated over $300 million for conservation activities. Dr. Myers, welcome back to Berkeley.
Very glad to be here.
Tell us a little about the formative experiences in your childhood that might have pointed you in the direction of environment work.
Well, Harry, I was born and spent my first 11 years on a little sheep farm in the northern Pennines in England. You may be familiar with James Herriot country, you know, stone walls and rolling dales. Lovely country. But it was a little hill farm, 50 acres, mainly sheep. And it was a farm that had been in the Myers family for over 300 years since the farms were first generated. And unfortunately, in 1946, my father became too ill with rheumatism from trying to farm this rather water-sogged patch of heathland that he had to retire to the town. My father never wrote me a letter because he was virtually illiterate. He had difficulty signing his name. Fortunately, my mother was a school teacher, and she said, come hell or high water, her children were going to have a good education. And she was the one who got me into a good grammar school and then packed me off to Oxford. But on the whole, it was rather, what shall I say, a difficult lifestyle. And I didn't like it one bit. I did enjoy the countryside and the flowers in the spring and all that kind of thing. But farming is an 8-day week. Our house had no electricity or gas. We did everything, heating and cooking, with wood. The water came from a stream where the cows had first of all watered. Our toilet was 50 yards down the yard. It was a bit of a tough experience, and I didn't care for the farm or for nature at all in those days, and I hadn't even heard of environment.
And so did you do much reading in this environment, or was that to come later?
Strangely enough that you should ask that, Harry. I read voraciously. It was my great source of contentment. And I quite soon got hold of the Tarzan books and then the Rider Haggard books about Africa, and I was so enchanted by the news of all those lush environments, those jungles and the savannas and lions and elephants and goodness knows what. And really, that made a very, very big impression on me, which was, I would say, one of the chief factors that steered me toward Africa when I finally left college at the age of 22.
And you're a man of many careers, and your first one really was as a colonial administrator in Kenya.
That's right, in the great days of empire. I went to Kenya in 1958, age about 22 or 23. It was a marvelous job, and really the work was done in quite a democratic fashion. I was posted to an area of African tribes, first of all some coffee growers, and then the Masai tribe, which was fantastic. And really, I could only do anything with the active collaboration of the tribal elders and chiefs. I would have a certain amount of money from central government, and I would say to them, do you want a cattle dip, or a new school, or a community hall, or a road, or whatever? And for every $1 that came from central government, they had to raise $1 themselves. And we'd sit under a thorn tree and debate this for endless days and drink milk and blood and so on and so on. And it was such fine work, and it also had a lot to do with wildlife. I actually got paid to do work like that. At age 22, I had an area, the size of the Bay Area for sure, maybe larger, 50,000 people. Great stuff.
And you really had to win their respect.
Oh, heavens yes.
Yeah.
Oh, heavens yes. Quite soon after I was posted to the Masai area, just 2 or 3 days, the chiefs and a bunch of young warriors decided to take me on a walk through their area to get acquainted with what was what. and they wanted to set up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I looked at the map to see where they planned to take me, and I figured they were going to try to take this young white man from outside and walk him off his feet, show him what Masai were like. It was about 35 miles of a walk. But fortunately, I'd been a cross-country runner of some capacity in England, so we set out and we walked and walked and walked. Along the way, we came across a sleeping rhino, and we played a little game. Each of the group of 12 of us took it in turn to tiptoe up to the sleeping rhino with a pebble, with a little stone, and put it on the rhino's back. And of course, after a while, this pile of stones got quite big and heavy, and sooner or later, the rhino woke up. Fortunately, it was one of the warriors who was placing a stone when the rhino did wake up, but I was having a look at the trees round about and figuring how fast I could climb. And then finally, we got to a village at the far end. I was very tired. You know, 15 hours of walking in the equatorial sun really takes it out of you. They gave me a drink that looked like a strawberry milkshake in a gourd, and I knocked it down, and it really was quite restoring. But in fact, it was a mixture of milk and blood. And the Masai pointed out that the gourd from which I was drinking had been sanitized by another of the cow's products.
I see. Yeah. So you are front with the environment in that.
Very, very close quarters with the environment, yes.
And when your tour of duty ended, you stayed on and became a teacher and then a photographer.
Yes. Very shortly after I arrived in Kenya, the Africans said they really wanted independence. I'm not sure the two events were connected, but that's the way it was. So within 2 or 3 years, Kenya became independent, and I lost that job, and naturally enough, that was the end of empire. But I liked Kenya so much that I wanted to stay on there. I looked around for a job. I had no career plans or ambitions, and I became a high school teacher for a number of years. And you see, while I'd been working in Masai land, I'd worked on setting up a number of national parks, because there's wildlife wall to wall there. Can you believe that in one area you can see elephants, lions, leopards, rhinos, hippos, giraffes, buffaloes, antelopes, zebras, all before breakfast, with the backdrop of Kilimanjaro. So when I started teaching, I would spend almost all the vacations in the game parks, because I was really hooked on the wildlife. And that was the start of my environmental interest, though I wasn't aware at the time. And after a while, these safaris got rather expensive, so I tried to pay my way by selling a few photographs, found I could, and so threw up the teaching and became a full-time professional photographer, which was great, marvelous.
And your skills as a photographer, what you saw in the pictures you took, really heightened your sensitivity to the environment. I have a quote here from your biography. At Oxford, I attended classes on freedom, but watching the giraffes going it untrammeled way, as it were, the most inevitable thing in the world, I learned about another sort of freedom.
Yes, and that's what really stirred me. That was what hooked me. It wasn't so much the wildlife, it wasn't so much the lions and the giraffes. It was a lion and a giraffe in an African environment doing their own African thing. The lion doing what he wanted to chase the giraffe, and the giraffe trying to run away and doing their own African thing. That stirred me, and I find it very, very hard to encapsulate that in words. But even as I speak to you, I can feel myself coming alive with those memories.
It sounds like a combination of awe and respect.
Yes, and also feeling that I was a stranger in their midst, and I had to respect that, but also that I was part of their ecosystem, in that I'm also a vertebrate animal, maybe a bit of a wild animal. I also need to breathe oxygen. I also need food, and so on and so on. It made me feel at one with them, and more at one with myself than I'd ever felt in the big city of Oxford, let's say, or Nairobi.
You went on a lecture tour as something of a conservationist, and at some point somebody put in your head the idea of going to graduate school. Tell us about that and why you came to Berkeley.
Well, you see, my first degree was in French and German, and nothing at all to do with the environment. When I became a professional photographer, I learned pretty quickly that getting a picture of an elephant just standing there wouldn't get me any money. I had to get an elephant tearing up a tree, or I had to get a lion jumping on board a zebra. And getting shots like that is very difficult. I used to go out just before dawn every day, go to a water hole where I'd find a lion waiting in ambush for the zebras to come down and drink, and I'd wait and wait for hours until the zebras would arrive and the lion would attack. And stupid thing, it would miss 29 times out of 30. I'd have to sit there for 5 days before I'd finally get this work on action. And all the rest of the time, I'd just be sitting in my safari truck. So to pass the time, I started reading popular articles about wildlife, and then scientific articles. What makes the lion tick? What makes the zebra tick? How do they tick better together? And during 5 years, I put myself through an undergraduate course in biology without realizing what I was doing. And then I came on a lecture here to Berkeley, and the professor said, well, have you ever thought of coming to grad school and putting all this knowledge and understanding into some shape and so on? And I hadn't thought of that, but it didn't take me long to decide that that was what I really wanted to do. It took me until age 35 to know what I wanted to do with my life.
And then you really knew.
Yes, and I would say to students, don't say to yourselves that at age 20 you want to become a lawyer or a doctor for the rest of your lives, because the world is changing so much and you are changing so much. I've had 5 careers. A worthwhile person in the next century will have maybe 10 careers.
And your degree here at Berkeley was an interdisciplinary one.
Yes.
How important was that for what you were to do with your scientific work later?
Immensely important. I came here to study wildlife management, and that was okay, but I very soon found out that, well, wildlife needs to be managed because it is threatened. And then the question is, what is threatening it? And of course, it's growth in human numbers and growth in human activities. So then I wanted to go off and do some demography. Why are human numbers growing? Why do people in the tropics have 9 or 10 kids? And also, I want to do some economics and some political science, some international law, some agriculture, all kinds of things. And I couldn't do that in the wildlife management school, but fortunately at that time, Berkeley, alone among American universities, allowed people to do an interdisciplinary doctorate. And I took that up, and it was great, marvelous.
You said yesterday in your lecture that one of your professors taught you how to think sideways. What did you mean?
Well, that was Arnold Schultz. I've worked at Harvard, Cornell, Stanford, all kinds of universities, and I've never found a man of such stature as a teacher, maybe not as a scientist, but as a teacher and as a thinker as Arnold Schultz. He taught me that if you're to understand the environment, you have to look at water and plants and sunshine and all kinds of things, and also political systems and human values, human communities, all kinds of things come into it. And you've constantly to keep an open mind about further things that could come into it. Let me give you an example, a little story he once told about the English detective of fiction, Sherlock Holmes, who was called out to a murder case, and he went and had a look around and said, "How strange about the dog?" And people said, "What was strange about the dog? The dog didn't do anything. It didn't bark or anything." And Holmes said, "That's what was strange, that the dog didn't bark, because it knew the intruder." And that led to the solving of the case. Arnold Schultz constantly tried to teach me to keep ears open for the non-barking dogs around in the environmental scene. Marvelous teacher.
What would you tell a student are the key skills that an environmental scientist has to have?
Well, to realize that everything is interconnected. Boring, everybody knows that. But yet, we don't all altogether know that. You know, I mentioned in the lecture yesterday about the pro-life people interceding with Congress to cut back on the family planning funding. I don't agree with the pro-life people, but in a democratic country, they are entirely welcome to their own opinion. But as a consequence of intervening with Congress and cutting back on family planning, they have triggered an enormous increase in abortions in developing countries, quite the opposite of what they would have intended. They didn't consider that you can never do only one thing. If you go over there, you're not going over there. If you buy oranges, you don't then have money left to buy apples. There are always these trade-offs, always these interlinkages.
One also gets a sense in reading environmental work that one really has to have a global perspective, which is something that not all disciplines have.
Right. You see, acid rain, the burning of all that fossil fuel in the cars and so on in Ohio dump acid rain over the border into Canada and vice versa. If the Indians want to build their 100 million refrigerators without using CFCs, which they say are a bit expensive, that will deplete the ozone layer for people over California. If the Chinese want to fuel their development processes with all their cheap coal, they will throw enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into everybody's skies, and that will one day cause global warming over North America, might even cause your great grain belt to come unbuckled. We are no longer, I believe, we are no longer just Americans and Britons. We are first and foremost card-carrying citizens of one great global community. And secondly, we are Britons and Americans. That doesn't mean any less loyalty to our nation states. at the Olympic Games, Americans can cheer the socks off for their own teams and beat those damn Britons. But in significant ways, we are now all living together, whether we're aware of it or not, as one great global community. And that is a great challenge for the next century, I think, trying to figure out what that means and how to live along those lines.
And a third element that you've already touched on is kind of a long-term perspective, because the problem you're creating today isn't always apparent today. It's down the road that it really has its impact.
Yes, indeed. You see, students going to class today, or people who are walking the streets anywhere today, are almost certainly walking through an atmosphere that is changing more rapidly than at any time in the last 50,000 years because of global warming. Very difficult to perceive it because you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it, but golly, it is happening. It won't become a manifest problem for maybe another 10 or 20 years, but we are setting up the problem right now by our burning of fossil fuels. And in a longer another one in a longer-term perspective still, and that is mass extinction of species. All our other problems can be fixed up. If we want to clean up acid rain, we can do it. If we want to take care of global warming, we could do it. It might take 1,000 years, but we could do it. The length of time it will take evolution to come up with replacement species to match what we have today won't be a few centuries or thousands of years. It'll be at least 5 million years. So what we do or don't do in the next few decades will have an impact upon the planetary ecosystem, upon our Earth, our world, for the next 5 million years. That is 20 times longer than humans have been a species themselves.
You mentioned the problem of species extinction and the deforestation of the rainforest, which are two areas where you did path-breaking work.
Right.
Tell us a little about, once you left school, what were the factors in pointing you in the direction of these problems and how you came to conceptualize the problems?
Good thought. After I got finished at Berkeley, I went back to dear old Kenya because I loved the place so much. And I started out on a 2-year project for the World Wildlife Fund looking into the status of the cheetah throughout sub-Saharan Africa, very big area, 3 times the size of the United States. So I traveled around a lot. And it turned out that the main problem for the cheetah was not the fur coat trade as had been thought, but the spread of livestock husbandry, whether by subsistence pastoralists or by commercial ranchers. And after a while, you see, they were taking over the grasslands for their sheep and cattle, and the gazelles and other prey for the cheetah were getting squeezed out. And it struck me that these guys weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't breaking any law. They were just trying to earn a living, trying to get supper on the table. It was a case of right versus right. And that was when I really wanted to get more into population and economics and so on. But after I'd done that work, I began to wonder how fast species were really going extinct. And the official view by the World Wildlife Fund and others was 1 species per year. But I said, well, did that include insects? Oh, no, we haven't looked at the insects, we don't know. Does that include the species that you haven't identified as yet? No, how can... I did an analysis looking at all species, plants, insects, the whole lot, and my calculation was at least 1 species per day, not 1 per year.
We're being extinguished, yeah.
Yes, and what also struck me about that was that this was a new question, and I wondered why those hotshot, I was only just out of grad school, for goodness sake, why those hotshot scientists, biologists working in the wildlife field, why hadn't they asked that question? It was a bit like the non-barking dog. They never thought to ask the question, hey, how fast are species really going extinct? Are we possibly into the opening phase of a mass extinction, which, if allowed to continue, would match the dinosaur disaster 65 million years ago? Nobody thought to ask. And a lot of my career has been not so much supplying right answers to established questions, but trying to raise the right questions.
And once those questions are raised, one sees a problem, you actually almost have to put on another hat. The scientist becomes the activist, the political activist on environmental issues. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. I felt that if we were losing 1 species per day, golly, I wanted to try and do something about that. I could bestir my professional biologist colleagues, and a good number of them, like Paul and Dan Ehrlich and Peter Raven and Jane Lubchenco, there's a whole long line of them, have done a very, very great deal indeed. But I must say that most professional biologists, living at a time when Earth's diversity and abundance of life forms is being depleted like nothing in the last 65 million years, they seem to see no reason to say anything much about it at all. In fact, some, and this is maybe more on my side of the Atlantic than yours, but some over here as well, even tend to say, why do you spend time running off to the policymakers, the politicians, doing broadcasts for the public and writing popular books? They would say, doesn't this somehow demean our science? The public wouldn't understand it. And what business is it of theirs? I'm inclined to say that the more we go to Capitol Hill and make a big noise about mass extinction of species, the more the legislators might be inclined to supply more money for science. So, of course, we'll all win.
How do you account for this difference in your psychology?
Oh, boy. Well, you're really putting me on a spot here, and I don't want to say it'd be undiplomatic.
It was your education in Berkeley.
Well, you know, I really don't want to sound critical of my colleagues. I suppose I am in a way. But I find a lot of scientists get very wrapped up in what they're doing. They are pushing back the frontiers of truth, which is fine. We need a lot more of that, a great deal more of that. But they get so absorbed in what they're doing that they become a little bit detached from the world of politics and public opinion and policy making. And that, I think, is why, unwittingly, they don't get involved in that scene out there.
The one exception to this during the Cold War, of course, was the anti-nuclear movement, which drew heavily from scientists. Were you influenced at all by their efforts to cap the arms race?
Yes, I was. In fact, in 1983, I engaged in scientific analysis headed by Carl Sagan and John Holden, looking at nuclear winter, looking at the environmental impacts of nuclear war. And we came to the conclusion that even if one side won cold turkey with no damage to itself, nevertheless this smoke and other damage in the vanquished side would swirl right around the Earth and would bring on nuclear winter. There'd be enough smoke to shut out the sun, plants would die, we'd have very little chance of survival. So that meant that no side could possibly win. We might win in a strictly military sense, but in a sense that mattered, we'd all be losers. We could go off to New Zealand, we could sit in a warmed hut at the South Pole. That still wouldn't help us.
In a sense, the world was more politically ripe for those concerns about the dangers of the nuclear arms race because the Soviet-U.S. confrontation was so visible. Was the environmental setting as ripe once you really got into political activism with regard to the data that you were finding?
Well, in terms of the public response and the political response, no, and it still isn't. Even though in 1987 a United Nations Commission made up of bankers, industrialists, lawyers, farmers, politicians, all kinds of people from around the world, not a single eco-freak among them, spent 3 years looking at what are called environment and development, sustainable development. And I remember sitting in a Moscow restaurant on the last meeting, wondering how they could start a report. And they finally came up with this. They said, humankind faces two great threats. The first is the threat of a nuclear exchange, and pray God that is a receding prospect for the future. And the second great threat is grand-scale environmental ruin worldwide. And far from being a prospect for the future, that is taking place right now. And they said that in 1986. Leading politicians, prime ministers, leading financiers, nobody took very much notice. How much more are we threatened by environmental stuff now? I remember Gorbachev saying in 1991, the threat from the skies is no longer nuclear missiles, it is global warming and ozone layer depletion. There have been lots of other statements from these hard-eyed political leaders, but the public doesn't seem to take much notice. Maybe they don't believe it. In your election last week, there was hardly a single mention of environment. Even though your country is losing 4% of GDP to environmental problems, that means a big break on the economy. That means higher interest rates, higher mortgage rates, higher inflation, higher job losses. That's the economy. People's preoccupations last week, the way they voted, was determined by the economy. They don't realize they're also talking about the environment.
So you wrote in your book on environmental security you spoke of our limited capacity to think clearly about matters that are new to our experience. And you spoke of the need for imagination and not just intelligence and knowledge. Is that what is the problem here, or is it also political interests?
Well, that's a tough one. You see, I sometimes speculate that humankind has spent 99% of its existence as a hunter-gatherer before we even got into our caves, let alone get out, well, we were in caves. And to survive as a hunter-gatherer, you had to look beyond your own nose. You had to pool your own self-interest with a hunting band of maybe 50 others. Mm-hmm. They were the people who survived and passed on their enlightened genes to the next generation. We had to identify with 50 other people. Then, when we came out of our caves, we started living in villages, maybe 500 people, and we had to expand our notions of loyalty. And then little cities of maybe 5,000 people, then bigger cities, 50,000 people. City-states, maybe 500,000 people, like ancient Athens and Rome and so on. People kept on having to expand their horizons, but do it with the evolutionary equipment of living for 99% of our time as hunter-gatherers, identified with just 50 people. Now we live in nation-states of, well, 270 million in the United States. Some have even more. We have to make the final jump to a hunting band of 6 billion people. Mm-hmm. Some of the students will live in a world of 9 billion people. And to make that big final step is going to be very difficult. But again, it does not mean denying loyalty to the United States. It means recognizing we are all card-carrying members of one great global community. And that is tough. I must say, I find it hard to identify with those Bangladeshis who are drowning last week, maybe 50,000 of them. Intellectually, I feel that's awful, that's dreadful, we should just not allow it. But emotionally and psychically, and I suppose in a sense spiritually, it doesn't move me in the way that it should to maybe get up and do more of what I'm doing. I run around the world making lectures at Berkeley and so on about all this, but I really wonder what else I could do. I'm committed to the cause, but I wonder what else I could. You see, I'm quite sure that in 20, 30 years' time, when the Earth is ravaged with all kinds of environmental problems, and we've impoverished the planet for the next 5 million years, for goodness sake, people will say, hey, you guys, you experts in the late 1990s, you knew what was happening. What did you do about it? And I'm not sure I have a sufficient response. I write books, I give lectures, I lobby the White House and the World Bank and the United Nations Prime Minister, goodness knows who. But I think people might say, that wasn't enough, was it? Why didn't you think of something even better than that? And I don't have an answer yet.
So Paul Revere, as a Paul Revere of the environmental movement, your horse isn't adequate to take the message as far as you want. I'm curious, you know, if you look at your career, you had to sort of work the Masai in a sense. By work, I mean in a political sense, to educate them about the issues that require change. As a consultant, you're clearly a person who moves and speaks to important business groups, to political leaders, and as a teacher, students. Do you see differences in these groups in their response to convincing arguments about their environment?
Yes, I do. They're very big responses. You see, the business community tend, with some very notable exceptions, I must say, but they tend to look just at the bottom line, the next quarterly report. That's their time horizon. Politicians look to the next election. And who is to blame them? If I was a politician, I think I'd do the same. The marketplace says, in effect, that there's no future beyond 10 years. The interest rates indicate that the discount rates mean there's no future after 10 years that you can think about today. I think about my children and my grandchildren, so I'm thinking like 50 years ahead, but then I shan't be around for another 50 years. But the things we're doing to our planet will have an impoverishing impact for at least 1,000 years, and in some cases 5 million years, and I find it very, very difficult to stretch my mind like that. Arnold Schultz, where are you? Come and help. But at the same time, I think that we can squeeze through this bottleneck with reduced losses, let's say, where we are going to lose a lot, but we could also win a lot, we could still save a lot. I am struck that politicians can sometimes get off their butts and do something like, well, for instance, I would not have taken on a bet 10 years ago that by the year 2000 we'd get rid of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and we'd have peace in South Africa, peace in Northern Ireland, possibly peace in the Middle East. I would never have taken on a bet like that. Some people say, but you can't change people's consumption patterns, for instance. We have to get people off fossil fuels or we'll have a globally warm planet. People say you can't change consumption patterns. In the last 10 years, 60 million Americans have given up smoking. That's like a social earthquake overnight. There's no limit to what we can do if we really want to get on with it.
Do we require a cataclysm, some horrible event that a super sinking of a tanker or something, or something in nature itself to wake us up?
Well, you know, we aren't very good at planning, whether we're politicians or individual citizens. We tend to wait for the morning's mail and see what problems are brought and then deal with them. And that is purely reactive. Why can't we anticipate the morning's mail and anticipate these problems? We've got lots of science that tells us what's going to fall out of the sky onto our heads. Why can't we anticipate? And I do wonder about this myopia, it's not so much ignorance, it's ignorance. It's like that line from the Dire Straits song, denial is not just a river in Egypt. We don't want to think about the future like that. And yet we undoubtedly have the capacity to squeeze through this bottleneck. Can I tell you what does inspire me is the thought that we live at a time altogether unprecedented. For the first time in human history, entire segments of the global ecosystem face terminal threat. We might lose all tropical forests within the next 3 or 4 decades. We might lose savannas. We might screw up the climate and so on, so on, so on. And these are problems which have never arisen before. But we still have it in our hands. We still have time to do a great deal to turn those appalling problems into magnificent opportunities. We can still do it if we really want to. Do we really want to? Well, I think of, you know, what politicians have done and there's Americans giving up smoking. We could do it. We're the only generation that has had to face a challenge of this sort. No generation in the past has had to do it because the problems weren't there. And no generation in the future will ever have our glorious chance, because if we don't fix this problem, or today's students do, people in the future will have nothing left to do but to pick up the pieces off the floor that we pass on to them. So it's in our hands. And I think it's a magnificent opportunity, a great challenge. Sure, it's a super-scale challenge, altogether unprecedented. If we measure up to it, won't we feel like giants of the human condition? Marvelous time to be alive.
Some of the research you're doing now is on what you call perverse subsidies. What are they, and are they a handle on reaching people and changing our ways if they were done away with?
Yes, absolutely, by a long, long way. Harry, I've mentioned several times fossil fuels because that only brings on global warming, but urban smog and acid rain, all kinds of other problems. We need to get out of fossil fuels and into clean, renewable forms of energy like solar power, wind power. There's lots and lots available. Why don't we? Well, because they aren't competitive commercially in the marketplace with fossil fuels. But fossil fuels are so cheap artificially because of government subsidies. For every $1 going into solar power or wind power, there are $15 of government subsidy going into fossil fuels, which is crazy. Because of all the problems they cause, we should be taxing them highly. No subsidies at all. But instead of that, they're taxed up to the hilt. And the car industry, Detroit is on welfare, gets an awful lot of subsidies. If we were to get rid of these subsidies that are bad for the economy as well as bad for the environment, then we go an awful long way to fixing up a whole lot of problems in agriculture, water shortages, over-harvesting of fisheries, over-logging of forests, road transportation. We'd do ourselves a great deal of good economically and environmentally as well. It'd be a win-win situation.
If a student is wondering how they should prepare for this world you're describing of immense environmental challenges and a lot of public work yet to be done, what would you recommend, how would you recommend that they prepare for a career as an environmental scientist who also is an activist?
Well, I'd tell them to go and get as many courses they could in different fields that are relevant. not just ecology and economics, but also political science, maybe ethics, anthropology, all kinds of things. And also, especially, to find those courses on campus, just a very few, which would train them as a scientist to become an activist, to find out how the system works. Where are the nerve points in social systems or political systems where you can insert your lever and generate most leverage with multiplier effects? So there are places like that. And I also encourage students to bite the bullet and learn how to speak in public. I was once at a cocktail party in London, a government cocktail party, and who should come into the room but Margaret Thatcher? She walked around, as politicians do, saying to everybody, what do you do, and so on. And she came to me and I said, I'm an environmentalist. And she said, oh, you're one of those silly scientists who waste the taxpayers' money on environment. And I said, now, wait a minute, Prime Minister, it's not like that. If you'll give me just 30 seconds, I'll tell you it's different. And she said, all right, 30 seconds from now, go. And I had to start talking. After 30 seconds, she said, try another 30 seconds. And after that, she said, tomorrow, ring my secretary. Come in sometime next week. We'll have half an hour together. I would like all students to think, what would they say if they came face to face with a politician who said, you're wasting the taxpayers' money, justify it. 30 seconds, go.
Did any good come of your meeting with Miss Thatcher?
Oh, haven't you? So, yes. We had a series of meetings.
What about just the general public? What can the individual do if they believe in the message of the environmental movement, but they feel powerless to act?
Yeah, and that's an awful thing to feel powerless, because then you start to feel paralyzed, and of course you tune it out. I would. You really need to do something. And I would figure tackle the biggest threat of all in the long run, apart from mass extinction, and that is global warming, and that means getting out of fossil fuels. An average American can save enormous amounts of carbon dioxide causing global warming quite readily. Getting 5 miles per hour better mileage in the car will straight away do it. That'll save 1 ton of carbon per year, if you can believe. 1 ton, that's a heck of a lot. And how do you do that? Well, you don't have to go and buy a better, more efficient car. That would be very, very fine. But all you need to do is to drive a little bit more carefully. Don't scream up to the traffic lights going red and then stand on the brakes. That wastes gasoline. Save a lot that way. Recycle 1 newspaper, one aluminium can, and something else, 1 glass bottle per day, and that will save almost 300 pounds of carbon over the course of a year. Switch off unnecessary lights. That saves 200 pounds. And of course, a lot of these things, like switching off unnecessary lights, driving more carefully, will put money in your pocket. It's a win-win situation. At the end of the year, an average American family can save enough money, let alone carbon, to go off and have a long weekend at some seaside resort. And apart from that, I would say a citizen should do their homework, get informed, and then join, an environmental group of choice. There are lots and lots of really very good ones. And when you've joined one, join another. Don't ask, can you afford it? Ask, can you afford not to do it? And bear in mind that in America, there are 10 million paid-up members of environmental groups. There are a lot of folks out there. And in Denmark, there are more members of environmental groups than there are Danes.
Looking back at your quite interesting life, your many careers, teacher, photographer, administrator, what lessons are there for students about learning to conceptualize, learning to be an activist, using science in the public policy arena? Any or all of those?
All of the above, and one that's even more important, while you're at school, teach yourself to teach yourself. Don't be content with the stuff you learn to get a bachelor's or a PhD. Above all, learn to learn, because the world is changing so fast, and there's so much knowledge coming on stream. Learn to learn. That's what Arnold Schultz family taught me. And to become an activist, recognize that there's been no time like now when you can really count, when you can register your opinion, most especially in the dollar marketplace by your consumption patterns, and use the internet. It's fantastic now. You can reach out and make common cause with people all around this country, all around the world. As somebody said, there's been no time like the present. This is a time when everybody can be somebody and nobody need be nobody. And if you think yourself too small to make a difference, Well, you haven't been in bed with a mosquito.
One other question that comes to mind is, do you ever have a conflict between your role as a scientist and your role as an activist?
How do you mean?
Well, just in terms of what a political cause might dictate versus what the science itself reveals.
No, I've never ever taken any political stance except to be grounded in good science. I've been very careful not to exaggerate, to overstate a case, because if my scientific credibility goes, then it'd take 50 years to get it back.
One final question. If there's a message out there for the American people about our record in environmentalism, what message would you like to give them?
I would say that they should reflect on the fact that they have 5% of the world's population, but they're emitting 23% of all carbon dioxide emissions. They are wrecking climate right around the world for everybody, including polar bears at the North Pole, penguins at the South Pole. Everybody will be affected by this profligate use of fossil fuels, and especially the great car culture. And they shouldn't think that they couldn't switch over a period of time. In Britain, we pay $5 for a gallon of gasoline in our economy that doesn't go for a loop. But beyond that, I think I would urge Americans to recognize that they are the most powerful country in the world, not just militarily, but financially, economically, scientifically, and the most democratic country in the world by a long, long way. The world needs leadership. That's the resource in shortest supply of all. This country could offer leadership. It does need lots and lots of public opinion behind that to prod the political leaders into action. While I've been coming to your country since 1960, I've seen several revolutions, civil rights, the peace movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, several other movements. All of these have been caused by grassroots Americans, millions of them saying, darn it, we want things to be different. And they've kept at their course for year after year after year, till finally the politicians come running along behind and say, we will lead you to the promised land. This is a marvelously democratic country. This is my 86th visit, and I look forward to many more. Great country, even though it is causing much more damage to the global environment than any other country. It can be so readily turned around, put money into your American pockets, and it'll give you such a great sense of excitement that you could play a leading part in saving the world at a time of unprecedented threat.
Dr. Myers, thank you very much for coming back to Berkeley to be the Hitchcock Lecturer, and thank you very much for talking with us about your life and your work.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.